Darren lived alone on a small mining moon far away from Earth and even farther from the big cities in space. His home was made of metal and wires and dust. He worked every day fixing old machines that others had thrown away. He was good at fixing things because he liked quiet, and machines never asked questions. They just needed care and patience, and that was all Darren ever had to give. One day Darren walked into the old spaceport near Sector 9, where the junk auctions were held every month. People gathered from all over the nearby systems to sell and buy scrap metal, broken robots, burned out engines, and sometimes old space shuttles that had seen better days. Darren did not come here often, but today he had extra credits in his pocket and a strange feeling in his chest like something was about to change. The auctioneer stood on a rusted platform yelling numbers and names and lot numbers as machines rolled by. One after another old parts were sold to smiling junkers who clapped and cheered and shouted over each other. The smell of oil and smoke filled the air. Darren waited near the back with his hands in his coat and his eyes scanning the floor without interest. Nothing new, nothing special, nothing worth buying. Then he saw it. A strange shape covered in tarps and cables slowly rolled into the center of the auction floor. It was large and wide and shaped like no ship Darren had ever seen before. The metal hull was cracked and covered in black marks like it had crashed hard. One of the engines was missing and the other looked melted like wax in fire. People around him laughed and pointed and made jokes about how this piece of trash should not even be for sale. The auctioneer cleared his throat and shouted again. Lot 74. Alien wreckage from asteroid belt near Delta 6. No records found. Salvage value unknown. Starting bid 50 credits. Anyone. Anyone at all. No one raised a hand. The room was silent for the first time in a long while. The ship looked like it would fall apart if someone touched it. Darren looked at the wreck and felt that strange feeling in his chest again. He was not sure why, but something about the ship called to him. Maybe it was the shape or the silence around it, or maybe it was something else he could not explain. He raised his hand. 50 credits, called the auctioneer. Do I hear 60? Someone near the front laughed and shouted. Make it 100 and throw in a toolbox. The crowd laughed, but no one else bid. Sold for 50 credits to the man in the back. Darren walked up to sign the papers, while people still chuckled behind him. He ignored them. He had bought worse things before. But as he stood beside the ship, he felt something warm on his face, like heat from a fire. He reached out and touched the metal hull, and pulled his hand back quickly. It was warm. Not warm like it had been in the sun. Warm like something inside was alive. Darren narrowed his eyes and climbed the small ladder into the broken airlock. The lights inside flickered weakly, and the air smelled strange like flowers and smoke mixed together. He held his breath and stepped forward into the darkness. The walls were covered in symbols he did not recognize. Blue lines pulsed along the floor like veins in a living thing. Somewhere deeper inside, something hummed like a quiet song. He moved slowly, using a flashlight to find his way. The ship felt too quiet, like it was waiting for something. He passed empty halls, broken doors, shattered panels. Then he saw it. A large round chamber at the end of a narrow hallway. In the center stood a pod made of glass and metal. Inside the pod was a shape. A person. No, a woman. Her skin was light purple and glowing like soft moonlight. Her eyes were closed. Her body wrapped in armor that looked like it had grown out of her skin. Her hands were crossed on her chest. She looked peaceful, like she was sleeping and dreaming of stars. Darren stood there unable to move or speak. He had never seen anything like her before. Not in books, not in vids, not in all his years working with strange tech. He reached out and touched the pod. It was cold, but a small panel blinked and hissed softly. The pod opened. A soft mist rolled out, and the woman took a deep breath. Her eyes opened and glowed for a second before settling into a soft violet light. She looked at Darren with a calm face and blinked slowly. He stepped back, unsure what to say or do. She spoke, but the words made no sense. A soft musical language that floated in the air like wind through glass. She looked around confused and touched her chest, and then touched the side of the pod. A small device on her wrist lit up, and after a few seconds her voice changed. Now Darren could understand. Where am I? She asked. Who are you? Why did you open the stasis chamber? Darren held up his hands and spoke slowly. I bought this ship at auction. I did not know you were here. I am sorry. The woman looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded once and said, You have freed me. That means something very important in my world. Darren frowned. Freed you? From what? She looked around at the broken ship and said, This vessel was my prison. I was locked here for many years. My body protected by sleep and my mind trapped in dreams. Darren felt a cold chill on his arms. He looked again at the ship and saw it differently now. Not a broken craft, but a tomb, a cage, a secret no one should have found. I am not a danger, she said calmly. You do not need to fear me. But you must understand. By opening that pod you made a bond. In my people's laws I now belong to you. Darren blinked. What do you mean belong? Like a helper. A friend. She shook her head and said softly, No, a life bond. I am your wife now. The silence in the room was deep and heavy. Darren opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. All he could do was stare at the alien woman who now stood before him, alive, breathing, and calling him husband. Outside, the auction had already moved on. Another wreck being sold. Another joke shared between junkers. But none of them knew what Darren had found. A crashed ship for pennies. And something else. Something much stranger than a broken engine. Darren stood frozen in the quiet chamber of the wrecked alien ship, staring at the glowing woman, who called herself Sarah. His hands trembled slightly, and his mouth felt dry as if all the words he wanted to say had vanished into the cold air of the broken vessel. She looked calm, as if nothing about this moment was strange or wrong. She stood tall, her armor shifting gently as she moved like it was part of her skin. Her purple eyes never left Darren's face, watching him, like she was trying to understand the thoughts in his mind. He swallowed hard and finally managed to speak. I do not understand. You said something about a bond. A life bond. A wife. What does that mean in your world? Sarah tilted her head slightly and stepped out of the pod, fully standing with strength and grace that made her seem more like a queen than a prisoner. She spoke in a soft voice. In my culture, when one is freed from life stasis by another without command or consent, that act creates an ancient bond of trust and honor. You are now my chosen, my mate by tradition and law, my protector and partner. Darren took a step back, unsure of what to feel. He had bought a broken ship for scrap, and now he was being told he had taken a wife from a forgotten alien empire. He looked around the broken chamber, the flickering lights, the cracks in the walls, the silence that still felt heavy like ghosts were hiding behind the shadows. I do not want to force anything, Darren said finally. I was just trying to explore. I thought I was alone. You were honest and kind, Sarah replied, her voice calm and steady. You did not harm me or leave me to die. You treated this wreck with care and walked through it without fear. That speaks of your soul. She moved closer and gently touched her fingers to his shoulder. I know this is not your way, and this bond may not mean the same in your world, but I will stay beside you until my debt is paid. I will protect you with my life and help you rebuild what is broken. Darren nodded slowly, trying to understand the weight of her words. He did not know what future this strange connection would bring, but he saw no lies in her eyes. Only honesty and something else he could not yet name. We should get out of here, he said. This place is not safe. There are people who saw me by this ship, and they will wonder what I found. Sarah nodded and stepped aside, allowing him to lead the way back through the ruined corridors. She moved like a shadow, silent and aware of every sound around them. Darren's flashlight cut through the dark, showing twisted panels and broken walls, but also glowing veins of alien tech pulsing softly beneath the floor. As they reached the airlock, Sarah paused, placing her hand against the wall. Her armor lit up, and a small compartment opened, revealing a strange round object glowing with blue light. She picked it up and handed it to Darren. What is this, he asked. A core memory, she answered. It contains knowledge of this ship, its history, its systems, and secrets. You may learn from it when the time is right. He took the object and placed it carefully in his tool pouch, then opened the outer hatch. The cold moon air rushed in, dry and sharp. They stepped out into the open, and Darren led her back to a small transport sled waiting near the auction yard. No one seemed to be watching. Most of the buyers and sellers were busy arguing over prices and bragging about their finds. The broken ship sat quietly in the corner like a pile of forgotten metal. No one guessed what lay inside or who had just stepped out of it. They reached Darren's workshop a few miles away, hidden near the cliffs of the southern crater. The building was made from metal sheets bolted into rock with solar panels on the roof and old antenna towers poking into the sky. Inside it was quiet, filled with tools, machines, old parts, and shelves of things Darren had collected over the years. Sarah looked around with curious eyes, touching things gently and asking quiet questions about their use. Darren answered what he could and smiled at her interest. It felt strange having someone else here moving through his space, like she belonged without asking permission. She sat down at the workbench and placed her hand on the metal surface. The armor on her wrist opened and revealed a small screen glowing with data in symbols Darren could not read. With a few touches, she activated a soft blue light, and a projection appeared above the table. "This is the map of the ship," she said. "It can be restored. The damage is deep but not beyond repair." "You want to fix it?" Darren asked, surprised. "That old thing. It is not just a ship," Sarah said. "It is my home, my past, and my promise. If we fix it, I can fly again. We can escape this moon if danger comes, or find a new home far from those who may hunt us." Darren thought about the strange looks he had seen in the auction house, the greedy eyes, the quick whispers. He had seen it before when someone found rare tech or lost treasure. If they knew about Sarah, they would come. And they would not come to talk. "You are right," he said. "We should hide the ship and fix it piece by piece. But we need parts and power and tools that I do not have here." Sarah nodded. "I can help. I remember how to shape metal, how to code systems, how to rebuild engines. Together we can do this." That night Darren cleared a small room for Sarah and gave her clean clothes and tools. She worked beside him, without complaint, learning human systems as quickly as he learned her alien symbols. They spoke little, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with quiet trust and growing respect. As the stars rose over the mining moon, Darren sat outside watching the sky. Beside him Sarah stood, with arms crossed, looking up at the same stars. He glanced at her and felt something strange in his chest, not fear, not confusion, but something warmer and deeper. She turned to him and said, "Do you regret it? Buying the ship?" Darren looked back at the sky, then at her, and said, "Not anymore." They sat in silence, once more two souls from different worlds joined by accident or fate, or maybe something greater. And though danger still waited beyond the hills and stars, for now they were safe. And for the first time in many years, Darren did not feel alone. The next morning came with pale light stretching across the mining moon, and Darren was already awake, working with a spanner in one hand and a data reader in the other. Sarah stood beside him, quiet, and focused her fingers, moving across a strange tablet covered in alien symbols that glowed faint blue in the workshop light. They had already opened the ship's memory core and started decoding its mainframe, slowly revealing old flight data, power systems, and something strange hidden deep in the files. Darren could read part of it thanks to Sarah's translation device, but much of it was still locked in code, far beyond human systems. He leaned closer to the screen and frowned at a flashing symbol shaped like a spiral, surrounded by fire. "What is that?" he asked while brushing dust from the screen. Sarah's face became serious, and her fingers paused above the surface of the tablet. She took a slow breath and said, "That is a seal. A high-level warning from the high guard of my world. It means this ship was not just a prison. It was carrying a forbidden asset. Something dangerous. Something powerful." Darren blinked and stared again at the spiral. "You mean like a weapon?" "Not a weapon in the way you understand," she replied. "Something ancient. A vault of knowledge and technology lost in war. Even in my time, it was kept away from the public. They feared what it could do." Darren scratched his head and looked around the small room. "So this isn't just a broken ship. It's something way bigger, and people might come looking for it." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, if anyone knows this ship is active, they will come. And not just for me." That night Darren could not sleep. He lay on the small cot in his back room, listening to the hum of his workshop and the soft shifting sounds of Sarah moving in the other room. His mind kept racing through memories of the auction, the laughter, the old wreck, the glowing pod, and now the warning inside the ship. What had he really bought for those 200 credits? What was waking up beneath his feet? The next morning brought answers and more questions. Sarah had accessed a deeper section of the ship's logs revealing video records and sensor scans. Together they watched old footage of stars passing fast across the screen as the ship jumped through systems Darren had never seen. Then a voice appeared. Deep, calm, and commanding. It was the ship's original AI. Welcome, prisoner unit Sarah. Status locked. Mission unknown. Time elapsed since last contact. 1,312 cycles. The AI voice continued listing data about the ship's crash. How it had been struck by an EMP field, how the pod had sealed Sarah in stasis, and how the ship's engines had died drifting until gravity pulled it into the asteroid belt where scavengers had finally found it. Darren leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. Over 1,000 years. You were asleep that long. Yes, Sarah said quietly. My world is gone. My empire is dust. And I am all that remains. He looked at her and felt a mix of sadness and awe. She had lost everything, yet she stood calm, ready to fight and move forward. He wondered if he could have done the same in her place. Suddenly alarms screamed across the room, red lights flashing on every panel. Darren jumped from his chair and ran to the screen. Outside near the front gate of his workshop, 2 armed men were approaching fast, their boots kicking up dust and their eyes scanning the walls with handheld detectors. Sarah moved beside him, her armor shifting into defensive mode, glowing softly along the edges. They are scanning for power sources, she said. They must have traced the energy spike when we activated the memory core. Darren grabbed a tool belt and motioned for Sarah to follow. He led her down a narrow stairway into the lower storage bay, where the ship's core sat half buried under old parts and broken metal. They crouched behind a shelf as footsteps echoed above them. The door burst open and heavy boots stomped through the workshop. Voices shouted orders, while crates were kicked aside and panels were pulled off the walls. One of the men cursed loud and angry, saying there had to be something here, something big, something hidden. Darren held his breath as dust floated in the air around him. Sarah closed her eyes and touched the side of her helmet. Her voice was silent, but her armor responded, pulsing with quiet energy, ready for battle. The intruders moved closer, their shadows stretching down the stairway. Then a crash and a shout, and a heavy sound of metal falling. Sarah sprang forward faster than any human Darren had seen, her movements like lightning and wind. She struck the first man with a single blow, knocking him into a wall. The second raised his blaster, but she twisted under it and swept his legs, sending him crashing to the floor. Darren ran to help, grabbing a metal pipe and swinging it toward the weapon on the ground. The fight lasted seconds and ended with both men groaning in pain on the floor, their weapons scattered and armor cracked. We need to go now, Sarah said. They were scouts. More will come. We must move the ship and erase the power trail before others arrive. Darren nodded and grabbed his pack, already thinking of what parts they would need. They worked through the night, dragging panels, connecting wires, and stabilizing the broken systems of the alien ship. Sarah guided him through ancient protocols, while Darren used his tools to bypass damaged relays and reroute power through human-made converters. By morning, the ship's lights were steady, and the engine room hummed with soft energy. They had not made it fly yet, but it could now move short distances on hover mode, just enough to relocate it far from the auction zone. Together they drove it into the deep canyon near the edge of the southern crater, hidden under rock layers and shielded by jamming signals Sarah installed using parts from the broken scout's gear. They collapsed in the dust, breathing hard and watching the stars fade behind the rising sun. Darren looked at Sarah and said, "That was close. Too close." She nodded and said, "You saved me. Again. And now I owe you even more." "No," Darren said quietly. "You saved both of us. And I think we are even now." She looked at him with a soft smile, the first he had seen from her. It made her glow a little brighter, and something in Darren's chest felt warm. "We are not just repairing a ship anymore," he said. "We are building something new. Together." Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his chest above his heart. "Together," she repeated. As the wind passed through the canyon and the stars faded behind the new light, Darren felt something settle inside him. Not fear, not confusion, but a beginning. A spark that said this was no longer just about survival or escape. This was something more, and it had only just begun. Dust filled the narrow air as Darren tightened the last bolt beneath the ship's engine panel, while sparks danced above his face and sweat rolled down his neck. Sarah knelt beside him, feeding energy wires into the converter box, her fingers moving fast and steady, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. The ship rested deep within the canyon, shielded by rock and sky, far from the eyes of traders, pirates, and scavengers. They had been working non-stop for 4 days, using every tool and trick Darren knew, and every secret Sarah remembered from her ancient world. Each day brought new problems: broken systems, unstable power surges, and corrupted code buried deep in the ship's core. But Sarah never stopped. Her mind was like fire, always sharp, always focused, and Darren found himself pushing harder just to keep up. He was tired, but he felt alive in a way he had never felt before. Not since childhood. Not since before Earth's war. Not since he had stopped dreaming. One afternoon, as he worked inside the control bay, he heard Sarah calling him from the top ridge of the canyon. He climbed up the path covered in loose stones and dust. There she stood with her arms crossed, her armor glowing faintly in the sun, and her eyes locked on the sky. He followed her gaze and saw a small black dot moving across the atmosphere, fast and low. It was a drone scout, one of the newer models built for long-range scans and deep recon. It moved in a zigzag pattern across the southern sky, then vanished behind a thick cloud. "That is not good," Sarah said in a calm voice. "They are sweeping for energy trails. The moment they find one that matches my ship, they will send a retrieval unit." "Can we hide the signal?" Darren asked while brushing sand from his jacket. "We already did," Sarah replied. "But if they get close enough, they can detect the ship's shape. Its signature is unique even after all this time." Darren clenched his jaw and looked back at the ship hidden below. "What do we do if they find us?" "We fight or we run," Sarah answered. "There is no third option." That night they worked through the dark, using only low red lights to hide their position. Sarah finished aligning the stabilizer rings, while Darren rewired the secondary control rods. Every step brought the ship closer to full power. Every minute felt like a countdown to something bigger than both of them. As they worked, Darren asked about her world. About the cities she once guarded, the sky towers, the crystal domes, the endless gardens that floated above oceans of light. Sarah spoke with a soft voice, her eyes distant, as if she could still see those places in her mind. "It was not perfect," she said, "but it was home. I was a protector, a sentinel assigned to the royal fleets. Then the war came, and everything changed." She paused for a long time, then said, "We lost not because we were weak, but because we trusted too much. Our enemies used lies and fear. They turned our people against each other. And in the end we fell from within." Darren listened in silence, his hands never stopping his tools, clicking softly as he worked. He wanted to tell her that Earth had done the same, that humans had once burned their own cities out of fear. But he said nothing. Some pain needed no echo. The next morning they tested the engines. A low hum filled the canyon as the ground trembled and dust lifted from the rocks. Blue light flowed along the ship's hull, and the core pulsed with rhythm like a heartbeat. It was not ready to fly, but it was no longer dead. Later that day, while Darren scavenged parts from old mining stations near the crater edge, he heard voices through his comm. 3 men walking toward one of the abandoned outposts. They wore clean armor with private security logos and carried rifles. They were not miners, and they were not lost. He stayed hidden and listened. One man said, "Tracker pinged this way. Might be a false signal, but HQ wants it checked." Another said, "Keep your eyes open. Last time we ignored a ping, we lost a whole squad." Darren waited until they moved on, then slipped through a back path and returned to the canyon. His heart pounded as he told Sarah everything. She did not speak. She simply nodded and began preparing the ship for launch. "We do not have full lift yet," Darren said. "The stabilizers will crack under pressure." "They will hold long enough," Sarah answered. "We cannot wait any longer." Together they packed tools, supplies, data drives, and fuel rods into the storage chamber. Darren activated the external shields while Sarah programmed jump coordinates into the main console. The goal was not far, just a hidden moon, near the gas fields of Sector 5. Empty, quiet, and unregistered. As they prepared for launch, a deep rumble echoed across the canyon. Dust shook from the cliffs, and Darren looked up to see a black transport ship descending fast, its engines roaring through the sky. Sarah ran to the weapon controls and activated the outer defense field. A blue dome shimmered over the ship's surface as laser fire rained down from above. The enemy ship fired again, striking the rocks around them. Flames and sparks burst into the air, and chunks of stone fell like thunder. Inside the ship, Sarah shouted, "Engines at 40%. Core stable. Navigation locked." Darren ran to the pilot's seat, gripping the control stick. He had never flown anything beyond mining rigs, but his hands moved with purpose. Sarah sat beside him, her hands flying across the console. They looked at each other and nodded. No fear. No second thoughts. "Launch now," she said. The ship lifted from the canyon floor with a loud scream as the stabilizers groaned and the hull creaked. Rocks collapsed behind them and fire lit the ground. The enemy ship chased them, firing again and again. But Sarah's shield field held strong as they climbed through the smoke. Then, with a final surge, the ship cleared the canyon. Engines roared, and stars opened before them. Darren slammed the jump lever forward. Light folded, space twisted, and they were gone. Silence filled the cockpit as they floated in deep space. Only the sound of breathing and the quiet hum of systems remained. Sarah leaned back and looked at Darren with calm eyes. "You did well." He smiled and said, "We did well." She nodded and looked out at the stars. "We are not safe yet, but we are free." And somewhere in that silence, Darren felt something new growing. Not just survival, not just escape, but a future. One built not from luck or credits, but from choice. And beside him sat the reason he chose to keep going. An alien warrior, a partner in the fight, a strange beginning that felt more right than anything he had ever known. Together they drifted forward into the unknown, toward whatever came next. Stars drifted slowly across the wide window of the ship as Darren sat in the pilot's seat, watching space move like a living ocean around them. Beside him, Sarah worked in silence, her hands running across the console as she read alien systems and scanned nearby sectors. They had jumped far beyond the mining moon, beyond the reach of scanners, and greedy eyes now flying through the dark between systems where few dared to travel. The ship creaked gently like an old house learning to breathe again after years of silence. Some panels still flickered with damaged code, and warning lights blinked across the dashboard, but the core was stable and the hull was sealed. They had made it out. They were alive. But danger was not gone. Sarah turned to Darren and said, "The coordinates are locked for the next jump, but we must wait 12 hours for the engine to cool." The strain from the first escape nearly overloaded the stabilizers. Darren nodded and leaned back in his chair, breathing slow as he looked out at the stars again. "Do you think they will follow us?" He asked the question quietly, like it might change the weight in the room. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. "They will try, but they do not know where we jumped. Our trail is scrambled. For now we have peace." They left the cockpit and walked together through the central corridor of the ship, where old markings from Sarah's world glowed faintly along the walls. Darren ran his fingers across the symbols, wondering what stories they once told. He wanted to ask, but also wanted to respect the silence in her eyes. Some memories were too heavy to share. They entered the living chamber, a space recently cleaned and fixed, where soft lights pulsed above and cushions lined the floor around a small table. Sarah brought out 2 food packs, one human, one alien, and they sat across from each other, sharing a quiet meal. Darren looked at the strange blue fruit on her plate and said, "Does that taste like anything on Earth?" Sarah smiled slightly and said, "Perhaps like what you call peach mixed with iron and a little lightning." He laughed and tried a bite of his own ration, wishing it tasted half as interesting as that. Then he grew quiet again, thinking of what they had escaped and what still waited ahead. After the meal, Sarah activated a projection from the core memory. A star map filled the room, showing systems Darren had never seen, planets marked with old symbols and red lines, tracing routes lost for centuries. "This is what the ship remembers," Sarah said. "Before it crashed. Before the war. Before everything was taken." Darren stepped closer, looking at a glowing mark near the edge of the map. "What is that?" he asked. Sarah answered softly, "That is Eris Prime, a sanctuary world. My people once stored knowledge there. Hidden vaults, healing temples, peaceful cities built inside crystal caves. She paused, then added, "If the vault is still there, we may find answers. Not just about the ship, but about my people, about why I was sent into stasis, and what they were really hiding." Darren nodded slowly. "Then we should go there. Find the truth. It is not that simple," Cyril warned. "Eris Prime may be watched. The vaults may be sealed. And others may be looking for the same thing." "I do not care," Darren replied. "If it means helping you. If it means understanding more than scrap and circuits. Then I want to go." Cyril looked at him for a long moment, then reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You are not what I expected," she said. "When I woke, I thought I would be alone again. But you have given me more than freedom. You gave me purpose." Darren felt his chest tighten slightly. He looked into her eyes and saw not just light but memory. Years of loss, pain buried under strength, and now something new. Hope. They spent the next hours fixing more of the ship. Sarah repaired internal doors and restored backup power to the medbay. Darren cleaned a few lines and adjusted the gravity field to make walking easier during jumps. Together they made the ship feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Later, as they prepared for the next jump, the ship suddenly shook. A warning alarm echoed through the hallway. Sarah rushed to the console and scanned nearby space. Darren followed close behind, heart pounding. "An energy spike," she said. "A wave from a nearby satellite. It is not a ship, but something old, still active." "Could it be part of your world?" Darren asked. Sarah studied the signal, her eyes narrowing. "The code is familiar, but corrupted. If it is what I think it is, it may lead us to Eris Prime." They adjusted the ship's path and moved toward the signal. Hours passed as stars turned and silence wrapped around them. Then they saw it, a large metal structure floating near a dying moon, covered in vines and space dust. Its shape cracked and broken, but still alive, still glowing. They docked carefully and entered through a narrow breach in the hull. Inside was a long hallway filled with soft light and cold air. Sarah moved ahead, her steps slow and careful. Darren followed, holding a small scanner that clicked with every pulse from the walls. They reached a chamber with a glowing pedestal. On it sat a sphere made of glass and stone. Sarah touched it gently, and the sphere lit up, revealing images of her world. Cities in light, ships like birds, people laughing and building. Darren watched silently as her face changed. A tear rolled down her cheek, not from sadness, but from memory, from feeling her past again, from knowing she was not forgotten. Then the sphere spoke. In her language, "Sarah, guardian of the third flame, if you hear this, then the vaults still call you. Return to Eris, restore what was lost, and become what you were meant to be." Sarah stepped back, her breath shaking. Darren caught her gently. "You are not alone," he said. "Not anymore." They returned to the ship and set a course for Eris Prime. Now the mission was more than escape, more than survival. It was a journey into truth, into history, into destiny. As the ship jumped again, leaving the satellite behind, Darren sat beside Sarah in the cockpit. She looked forward, her eyes bright with new fire, not just from duty, but from purpose. He watched her and thought about how this all began. An auction, a wreck, a strange pod in a silent ship. He had bought it for pennies, expecting scrap, and found a life, a partner, a path he never imagined. Now they were not just running from danger. They were running towards something far greater. Together. The stars outside the window shifted as the ship glided through the dark space between worlds, its engine humming like a calm heartbeat, guiding Darren and Sarah across the endless night. They had left the forgotten satellite behind, carrying with them the message hidden inside the glowing sphere. Now they were heading toward Eris Prime, a name that echoed in Sarah's memory like a song once heard in a dream long ago. The ship's lights glowed soft and blue, while the control panels blinked with gentle signals from systems slowly healing under Darren's careful work. Sarah sat in the co-pilot seat, reviewing old records and pulling fragments of maps from the ship's memory. Darren stood nearby, adjusting the stabilizer controls and wiping sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his jacket. Sarah looked up and said the entrance to Eris Prime's vault should be on the northern ridge of the planet, surrounded by cliffs and cloud towers. "The maps are damaged, but the signal is strong and clear. It is waiting for us." Darren leaned over the screen and nodded slowly. What do you think is inside? What are we going to find? Knowledge, Sarah answered. Memory, truth, and maybe danger. He exhaled and turned to the navigation panel. Then let's find it and hope it does not bite back. As they approached the edge of the system, the ship passed through a field of glowing dust and swirling light. Darren watched from the window as the colors shifted from silver to deep violet, like clouds made from dreams. Sarah explained that this was called the Whispering Veil, a natural field that surrounded Eris Prime and protected it from detection. Old stories say the veil sings to those who carry guilt, she said softly. But I think it just reminds us that beauty can survive even in broken space. The ship passed through without trouble, and soon the planet appeared before them. A massive world covered in green and gold with rings of crystal clouds spinning gently across the skies. Darren stared in silence as the world filled the window. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Not in any video or story or dream. This place, he said. It looks like a painting. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled. It is real, and it is ours to rediscover. They descended slowly through layers of wind and mist. The ship's sensors scanned the surface until they found a flat area near the base of a mountain range, where old towers stood half buried in vines and thyme. The landing was soft. The air was thick but clean. And when the hatch opened, a wave of warm wind swept through the ship, carrying the scent of flowers and something older than memory. Darren stepped out first, boots pressing into the soft soil, while birds with wings like glass flew overhead. Sarah followed, her armor adapting to the new air, glowing gently as it synced with the planet's rhythm. They walked side by side through the ruins of a forgotten outpost, where broken columns leaned over cracked stones, and strange plants glowed faintly in the shadows. Sarah paused near a large wall covered in carvings, and placed her hand against the surface. The stone responded to her touch, glowing with soft blue lines that spread across the wall like veins waking after sleep. This is it, she said. The gate to the vault. It still knows me. Darren watched as the ground trembled slightly, and the wall shifted open, revealing a long stairway descending into the earth. Cool air rushed upward, carrying a hum, like a quiet song buried in the stone. They entered together, moving slowly through the tunnel, while lights along the walls activated with each step. Sarah's face was calm, but her eyes burned with emotion. Darren reached out and gently held her hand, giving silent support without words. The stairway led to a large chamber filled with floating crystals and glowing panels that spun gently in the air. At the center stood a platform shaped like a star with a single chair carved from smooth stone. Sarah approached and sat in the chair. The crystals responded, glowing brighter as symbols appeared across the walls. A voice echoed through the room, speaking in her native tongue, then slowly shifting into words Darren could understand. Welcome, Guardian. The Vault of Eris awaits your command. She spoke a series of commands, and the platform lit up with layers of data spinning above their heads. Images of her people filled the air. Stories of science, peace, music, and light. Then came images of war. Explosions across cities. Ships falling from the sky. And the stasis pod locking her inside before the final collapse. Darren stood quietly, trying to absorb what he saw. Your people were beautiful, he whispered. They built wonders. And lost everything. Sarah looked at him, with eyes full of both pride and sorrow. They believed in unity, in sharing knowledge, but they were betrayed by fear. She stood and touched one of the crystals. A new image appeared, a map of nearby systems, with red markers glowing slowly like embers. These are signals from other vaults, she said, scattered across the stars. Some may still be alive. We can find them, Darren said. One by one, we can bring the truth back. Sarah nodded slowly, then looked toward the ceiling, where a projection of her home world shimmered like a star. Yes, but first we rest. And remember. They left the vault and returned to the ship as the sun began to set across the wide horizon. Golden light touched the towers and vines as the world sang a soft tune only the brave could hear. Darren and Sarah sat outside the ship that evening, watching the sky change from blue to deep silver, while distant stars blinked like old friends. Sarah leaned against him and said, You gave me more than escape. You gave me this moment, this peace. He looked at her and replied, You gave me purpose. Before you I was just surviving. Now I am part of something greater. She smiled and took his hand. Then let us keep walking this path. Together. As night fell around them and the wind whispered through the trees, Darren knew deep in his heart that this was no longer just a journey for survival. This was a journey of legacy, of love, of healing old wounds. And beside him sat the one who had brought that light back into his life. Not just an alien, not just a warrior, but his bondmate, his guide, his hope. And their journey was far from over. The ship hovered above the wide valleys of Eris Prime, its shadow sweeping over crystal trees and ancient ruins as Darren and Syrah prepared for their next journey. The vault had given them more than knowledge. It had given them direction. Across the stars, signals still whispered, calling for help, calling for answers, calling for someone who remembered what was lost. Darren stood in the cockpit watching the horizon while Syrah checked the last systems. Her fingers danced across the glowing panels, adjusting coordinates and rerouting power through repaired circuits. The ship felt stronger now, like it had found its heartbeat again, like it was alive and ready. Outside, the last light of the sun stretched across the world, painting everything in soft gold. Birds with long tails flew in spirals through the warm air, while rivers shimmered with hidden energy. Darren could hardly believe this world was real, so full of life, so untouched by the war that ended Syrah's people. He turned to her and said, "Do you really think there are more survivors out there? Do you believe others like you are waiting in stasis pods across the galaxy?" Syrah looked up, her eyes calm but bright. "I do not just believe it. I feel it. The vaults were not made to die. They were made to last. And somewhere others wait like I waited, trapped in sleep, hoping someone would remember." Darren walked to her side and nodded. "Then let us find them. Let us bring them back." They launched into the sky, the ship climbing through clouds as the engines roared with steady force. The stars welcomed them back like old friends, shining over the curve of the world as Eris Prime faded into the distance. Their path was not random. The vault had shown them a chain of coordinates linked together across the old empire. Each location held fragments of history, clues, technology, and maybe people. The first signal took them to a dead moon where a temple once stood high on a cliff, now buried beneath layers of ash. They landed near a broken tower, where the dust had swallowed time. Syrah and Darren walked side by side into the ruins, scanning for power readings. Below the temple, they found a chamber carved into the rock, lit only by the glow of Syrah's suit. A single stasis pod waited in silence, covered in frost. Inside was a figure with markings like Syrah's, but older, wearing armor cracked by time. Syrah placed her hand against the glass and whispered a name. The pod responded, its systems warming as the lights began to pulse again. "She is one of the first," Syrah said. "A teacher, a guide. Her name is Relha." They waited as the pod opened slowly, letting out a wave of cold air. The woman inside took a breath, then another before opening her eyes. She looked at Syrah and spoke a word Darren did not understand but felt deep in his chest like a drumbeat. Syrah smiled and replied in the same language, then turned to Darren. "She remembers. She thought all was lost. But now she sees there is still hope." They brought Relha aboard and gave her food, water, and time. Her mind was clear and strong, her voice filled with old stories and wisdom that had not been spoken in ages. She confirmed the vaults were part of something bigger, a network meant to survive the fall of their kind. And now, with Syrah awake, the system was waking too. They followed the next signal to a drifting station hidden in a cloud field above a gas giant. The structure was massive, shaped like a spiral shell, turning slowly in silence. Inside, they found machines still working, scanning and repairing long-forgotten systems. And 3 more pods. 2 occupied, 1 empty. Syrah activated the release codes, while Darren kept watch, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The pods opened with soft hissing sounds, revealing 2 young males barely older than Syrah, wearing light armor and glowing tattoos. Both opened their eyes and smiled when they saw her. They remembered. The ship began to feel small, with more voices, more footsteps, more purpose. Each survivor brought pieces of culture and memory, music, symbols, laughter, and pain. They shared meals together around the same table where Darren and Syrah had once eaten alone. Now the silence was filled with voices speaking different words, but carrying the same feeling, hope. As the days passed, Darren watched Syrah change. She moved with strength and confidence, leading the others, teaching, guiding, answering their questions with quiet wisdom. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a leader. But she never left Darren behind. Each evening they met on the viewing deck, watching stars pass by as the ship carried them deeper into forgotten space. They spoke of the past, the future, and what it meant to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. One night Sarah turned to Darren and said, "When I woke, I feared I would be alone. I thought I had lost everything. But now I see the universe had other plans." "You found me," he replied, "but you saved me." They kissed beneath the stars, their hands holding tightly, as if afraid the moment might slip away. But it did not. It stayed. Because it was real. Their journey continued. They woke more survivors. They repaired more systems. They reconnected the broken links of an empire that once reached across galaxies. They became a new kind of crew. Human and alien. Bound not by blood or law, but by shared pain and shared hope. One day, after many jumps and many rescues, Darren stood before a new vault door deep within a floating asteroid. Beside him stood Cirrelha, and the others, each ready for whatever lay beyond. He looked at Sarah and asked, "What comes next?" She smiled and said, "We rebuild. Not to restore what was, but to create what could be." Together. The vault opened with a sound like thunder, followed by silence so deep it made them feel small and strong at once. Inside, the chamber lights began to rise one by one, a new beginning born from the ruins of the past. And through it all, Darren held Sarah's hand, knowing that what had started with a cheap ship and a silent pod had turned into something no credits could buy. A journey of love, a story of hope, a legacy shared between stars. Not just a human and an alien, but two hearts choosing to walk the same path. No matter the distance, no matter the danger. Together. Forever.